In the glittering halls of Oldenburg Palace, where tradition weighs heavier than gold crowns and public scrutiny never sleeps, a 7-year-old prince becomes the center of a storm that threatens to shake the very foundations of a 1,000-year-old monarchy. What happens when the innocent actions of a child are twisted by political enemies, sensationalized by ruthless media, and defended by a father whose every move is watched by millions? This is the true account of how Prince Alexander of Oldenburg, third in line to the throne, became both victim and catalyst in a scandal that would test the limits of royal duty, parental love, and the cruel price of being born into a life where privacy is a luxury no amount of wealth can buy. Behind the palace gates, where protocol governs every breath and public image matters more than personal happiness, a family fights to protect their youngest member from forces that seek to destroy him before he's old enough to understand why the world seems so determined to tear him down. The question isn't whether the monarchy will survive this crisis, it's whether a little boy's spirit will remain intact when the smoke finally clears. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Oldenburg Palace as Prince Alexander chased his golden retriever, Duchess, through the rose bushes. At 7 years old, he possessed the boundless energy that only childhood could provide, his laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls that had housed royalty for over a millennium. His nanny, Mrs. Hartwell, watched from a respectful distance, her trained eye never leaving the young prince as he played. Prince Alexander was the third son of Crown Prince Edmund and Princess Isabella of Oldenburg, a small but wealthy European kingdom known for its pristine landscapes and progressive policies. Unlike his older brothers, Prince Marcus and Prince David, who had already begun their formal education in royal protocol and state affairs, Alexander was still allowed the luxury of being a child, though that freedom came with its own set of challenges. The palace had been buzzing with activity all week in preparation for the annual Children's Charity Gala, an event that raised millions for underprivileged youth across Europe. Princess Isabella, known for her humanitarian work, had made this particular charity close to her heart, and the entire royal family was expected to attend. For Alexander, it meant wearing his formal military-style uniform, standing still for photographs, and trying not to fidget during what seemed like endless speeches. Crown Prince Edmund emerged from the palace's grand entrance, his expression troubled as he approached Mrs. Hartwell. Even at 42, he carried himself with the dignity befitting a future king, though the weight of his responsibilities often showed in the lines around his eyes. Today, those lines seemed deeper than usual. "How has he been this morning?" Edmund asked, watching his youngest son attempt to teach Duchess to sit. "Full of energy as always, Your Highness," Mrs. Hartwell replied with a warm smile. "Though I sense he's nervous about tonight's event. He's been asking many questions about why so many people will be taking photographs." Edmund nodded, understanding his son's apprehension. At 7, Alexander was just beginning to grasp the reality of his position. Unlike normal children who could make mistakes in private, every stumble, every moment of childish behavior, was potential front-page news. The pressure was something Edmund remembered all too well from his own childhood. Princess Isabella joined them on the terrace, her elegant presence immediately drawing Alexander's attention. At 38, she had managed to maintain her grace and composure despite 15 years in the royal spotlight, but today, her usual serenity seemed forced. "The communications team has briefed me on tonight's security protocols," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of concern. "Apparently, there have been some concerning social media posts about our family, particularly targeting Alexander." Edmund's jaw tightened. "What kind of posts?" "Nothing credible, but enough to warrant increased security. Some opposition political groups have been using our children as talking points in their campaigns against the monarchy's funding. They're calling our lifestyle excessive and questioning whether taxpayer money should support what they term royal luxuries." This wasn't entirely surprising. The Kingdom of Oldenburg had been experiencing economic challenges, and, as often happened during such times, the royal family became a convenient target for public frustration. However, involving children in political attacks was crossing a line that even their critics had previously respected. Alexander ran toward them, Duchess bounding beside him, completely oblivious to the serious conversation taking place. His cheeks were flushed from running, and his carefully combed hair had become disheveled, a sight that would have horrified the palace's image consultants. "Papa, Mama," he called out, breathless with excitement. Duchess learned a new trick. "Watch." He commanded the dog to roll over, which she did enthusiastically, earning applause from the small audience. Isabella knelt down to Alexander's level, smoothing his hair with maternal tenderness. "That's wonderful, darling. You're such a good teacher. Now, do you remember what we discussed about tonight?" Alexander's expression became more serious, though his eyes still held their characteristic sparkle. "The charity dinner. I have to wear my uniform and be very proper because people will be watching and taking pictures." "That's right," Edmund said, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "And, remember, some of those people might seem very interested in everything you do. Just stay close to Mama and me, and everything will be fine." What the royal couple didn't know was that several blocks away, in a cramped newspaper office, journalist Marcus Thornfield was reviewing photographs from the family's recent public appearances. Thornfield had built his career on royal exposés, and he had a particular talent for finding scandal where others saw innocence. His editor had made it clear that circulation was down, and they needed a story that would grab public attention. The photographs spread across Thornfield's desk showed the royal family at various events over the past month. Most were perfectly innocent, the family attending church, participating in official ceremonies, and engaging in charitable work. But Thornfield's trained eye caught something others might miss. In several photos, young Prince Alexander appeared to be making faces, fidgeting, or looking bored during serious moments. To most people, these would simply be signs of a normal 7-year-old struggling with formal situations. But Thornfield saw opportunity. With the right caption and context, these innocent moments could be spun into a story about royal disrespect and poor parenting. The political climate was perfect for such a narrative. He began crafting his article, carefully selecting the most unflattering photographs and writing captions that suggested defiance rather than childish innocence. "Royal brat shows true colors," he typed as a potential headline, then reconsidered. Something more subtle would be more effective. Questions raised about royal child's behavior at state functions seemed more credible while still carrying the desired implication. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Alexander was being fitted for his evening uniform by the royal tailor, Mr. Pemberton. The elderly man had been dressing royal family members for over 30 years and had developed a particular fondness for the youngest prince. "Stand still, Your Highness," Pemberton said gently as he adjusted the jacket's shoulders. "We want you looking your very best tonight." "Mr. Pemberton," Alexander said, trying his best to remain motionless, "why do people take so many pictures of us? At school, they only take pictures on special days." The tailor paused in his work, considering how to explain such a complex concept to a 7-year-old. "Well, Your Highness, people are interested in your family because you're special. Your papa will be king someday, and people like to know about their royal family. But why do they want to know if I make a silly face or if I drop my fork at dinner?" The innocence of the question struck Pemberton deeply. In all his years serving the royal family, he had watched several generations grow up under the intense scrutiny of public life. He had seen how it affected them, how it shaped their personalities and their relationships with the outside world. "Sometimes, Your Highness, people forget that being royal doesn't mean being perfect all the time. They expect you to be grown up even though you're still just a little boy." Alexander considered this seriously. "I try to be good, but sometimes I forget to sit up straight or I want to pet a dog when I'm supposed to be listening to speeches." "And that's perfectly normal," Pemberton assured him. "The important thing is that you keep being yourself while learning to be the best prince you can be." As the afternoon progressed, final preparations for the charity gala continued throughout the palace. The event would host over 300 guests, including foreign diplomats, business leaders, and prominent philanthropists. Security was tight, with both uniformed and plainclothes officers positioned throughout the venue. Princess Isabella reviewed her speech one final time in her private study, but her concentration kept breaking as she thought about the increasing pressure on her family. Social media had amplified every criticism, and she had noticed how even positive royal coverage often included negative comments from anonymous users. The democratization of opinion had made every citizen a potential critic, and some of those critics seemed particularly focused on finding fault with her children. Crown Prince Edmund was in his office, reviewing security briefings with Captain Morrison, head of royal protection. The reports indicated increased online chatter about the royal family, but nothing that crossed the line into credible threats. Still, both men agreed that extra precautions were warranted. "Sir, there's something else you should know," Captain Morrison said, his expression grave. "We've been monitoring several social media accounts that have been posting increasingly hostile content about Prince Alexander. While none of it constitutes a direct threat, the language has become more personal and vindictive." Edmund felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of language?" "Comments about his behavior at public events, calling him spoiled and undisciplined. Some users have created memes mocking his expressions during formal ceremonies. It's the kind of content that can quickly spiral out of control if it gains traction." The prince ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that revealed more stress than he typically allowed himself to show. "How do we protect him from something like this? He's 7 years old, Morrison. He shouldn't have to think about whether smiling at the wrong moment will make him a target. We're working with the palace's digital communications team to monitor the situation and respond appropriately to any false information. But, sir, with respect, this is likely just the beginning. The internet has changed how royal families are perceived and criticized." Edmund knew Morrison was right. His own childhood had included its share of public scrutiny, but social media had created an entirely new level of invasive commentary. Every photo could be analyzed, criticized, and shared millions of times within hours. The idea that his 7-year-old son was already experiencing this level of attention was deeply troubling. As evening approached, the royal family gathered in the blue drawing room for their traditional pre-event photographs. Alexander stood between his parents, his small hand in his mother's, looking serious and slightly overwhelmed in his formal uniform. The palace photographer, accustomed to working with the family, tried to coax natural smiles while maintaining the dignity appropriate for official portraits. "Remember, everyone will be watching tonight," Isabella whispered to Alexander as they posed. "Just be yourself, but mind your manners." "I will, Mama," Alexander replied solemnly, though his young mind struggled to understand why being himself required such careful consideration. Outside the palace gates, early arrivals for the charity gala were being photographed by dozens of professional photographers and amateur paparazzi. The red carpet event would generate hundreds of images, many of which would be scrutinized for any hint of scandal or impropriety. In this environment, even a child's yawn could become a story about royal disrespect. Unknown to the royal family, Marcus Thornfield had already submitted his article to his editor, complete with carefully selected photographs and inflammatory headlines designed to generate maximum controversy. The piece was scheduled to run in the next morning's edition, timed to coincide with coverage of the charity gala. The stage was set for a confrontation between a family trying to protect their child's innocence and a media environment that had little patience for the normal behavior of children, even royal ones. As the first guests began arriving at the palace, none of them could have predicted how dramatically the evening would change the trajectory of young Prince Alexander's life. The limousines began pulling up to the palace entrance as the sun set over Oldenburg's capital city, each arrival accompanied by camera flashes and shouted questions from the press gallery. Inside the palace, the royal family made their final preparations for an evening that would prove to be far more significant than anyone imagined. The grand ballroom of Oldenburg Palace glittered under crystal chandeliers as 300 distinguished guests mingled during the cocktail hour preceding the children's charity gala. Crown Prince Edmund and Princess Isabella worked the room with practiced ease, their years of diplomatic training evident in how effortlessly they moved from conversation to conversation, making each guest feel personally welcomed. Prince Alexander walked between his parents, his small hand occasionally reaching for his mother's when the crowd seemed particularly overwhelming. Despite his youth, he had been coached on proper etiquette, how to shake hands, when to bow slightly, and how to respond politely when adults asked him questions. To most observers, he appeared to be handling himself admirably for a 7-year-old in such a formal setting. However, what the royal family couldn't see was photographer James Mitchell positioning himself strategically throughout the evening. Mitchell had been specifically assigned by Marcus Thornfield to capture unflattering moments, and he had developed an expertise in timing his shots to catch subjects at their most vulnerable or awkward moments. When Alexander yawned during a particularly long conversation between his father and the German ambassador, Mitchell's camera captured the moment. When the young prince shifted from foot to foot while waiting for his parents to finish speaking with charity organizers, another photograph was taken. Each image, innocent in context, could be devastating when stripped of its surrounding circumstances. Ambassador Helena Vasquez from Spain knelt down to speak with Alexander during the reception, her grandmotherly warmth immediately putting him at ease. "Your Highness, I have a grandson about your age. Do you enjoy school?" Alexander's face brightened considerably. "Yes, ma'am. We're learning about different countries. Did you know Spain has festivals where people throw tomatoes at each other?" The ambassador laughed delightedly. "La tomatina. Yes, it's quite messy but very fun. Perhaps when you're older, you could visit and see it for yourself." Princess Isabella smiled as she watched the interaction, grateful to see her son relaxing and behaving naturally. These were the moments that reminded her why they continued to expose their children to public life despite its challenges. The opportunity to connect with people from around the world and learn about different cultures was invaluable. But Mitchell's camera captured only a split second when Alexander gestured enthusiastically while describing his favorite school subject, his movement appearing undisciplined when frozen in time without the context of his animated conversation about geography. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Thornfield sat in his apartment, reviewing the article that would run in the morning edition. He had crafted it carefully, using language that appeared objective while clearly implying criticism of the young prince's behavior and, by extension, his parents' child-rearing abilities. Sources close to the royal family express concern about Prince Alexander's deportment during official functions, read one paragraph. The 7-year-old's behavior has reportedly drawn private criticism from palace staff, who describe him as challenging and difficult to manage during formal events. These sources didn't actually exist, but Thornfield had learned that attributing controversial statements to unnamed palace insiders gave his stories credibility while protecting him from libel claims. The technique had served him well throughout his career, even when it meant fabricating quotes entirely. Back at the gala, the formal program began as guests took their seats in the palace's state dining room. Alexander sat between his parents at the head table, his legs barely reaching the floor from the ornate chair. The sight should have been endearing, a small boy trying to be grown up in adult surroundings, but, to critics looking for fault, even his youth could be portrayed as a burden on formal proceedings. Princess Isabella began her speech about the importance of supporting disadvantaged children, her words carrying particular weight given her own experience as a mother. "Every child deserves the opportunity to reach their full potential," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Tonight, we have the privilege of ensuring that financial circumstances never stand in the way of a young person's dreams." Alexander listened intently, though the complex language and lengthy presentation began to test his 7-year-old attention span. When he quietly asked his father for a sip of water, the request was perfectly reasonable, but Mitchell's camera captured the moment as if the child were being disruptive. The evening's most significant moment came during the charity auction, when a young girl named Emma Kowalski, a beneficiary of the charity's programs, was invited to speak about how the organization had changed her life. Emma, 12 years old and remarkably articulate, described growing up in poverty and how the charity's educational support had enabled her to excel in school despite her family's financial struggles. Alexander was visibly moved by Emma's story, his young face showing genuine emotion as she described the challenges she had overcome. When Emma finished speaking to thunderous applause, Alexander spontaneously stood up and began clapping enthusiastically, his childlike appreciation for her courage evident to everyone in the room. It should have been a beautiful moment, a young prince connecting emotionally with a girl his age who had overcome adversity. The spontaneous standing ovation that followed, initiated by a 7-year-old's genuine reaction, demonstrated the kind of authentic royal engagement that public relations teams could never orchestrate. But Mitchell's photographs told a different story. Shot from a low angle and timed precisely, his images made Alexander's standing appear sudden and disruptive rather than heartfelt. The sequence of photos suggested a child acting impulsively without regard for protocol, rather than a young person responding naturally to an inspiring presentation. After dinner, the royal family mingled with guests during the coffee service. Alexander, now visibly tired after hours of formal behavior, stayed close to his mother while she spoke with charity organizers. His energy was flagging, and he occasionally leaned against Isabella's leg, a natural response for any child in his situation. Dr. Margaret Chen, who ran educational programs for disadvantaged youth, was particularly interested in speaking with the young prince. "Your Highness," she said warmly, "I work with children your age every day. They would be so excited to know that a real prince cares about helping them with their schooling." Alexander perked up at this. "Do they like the same subjects I do?" "I really like reading adventure stories and learning about animals." "Many of them do," Dr. Chen replied. "Perhaps someday you could visit one of our programs and meet some of them." "I would like that very much," Alexander said earnestly. "Mama always says it's important to help people who need help." Isabella felt a surge of pride at her son's response, but she also noticed how tired he was becoming. The evening had lasted much longer than usual family functions, and maintaining formal behavior for hours was exhausting for any child. Captain Morrison approached Crown Prince Edmund discreetly. "Sir, I've received word that several online platforms are already posting unauthorized photographs from tonight's event. The palace's communications team is monitoring the situation." Edmund nodded grimly. "Any immediate concerns?" "Nothing threatening, but some of the commentary is becoming increasingly personal regarding Prince Alexander. We should be prepared for tomorrow's media coverage to focus heavily on his presence at tonight's event." The prince felt a familiar knot in his stomach. He had hoped that their son's first major charity gala would be remembered for the important cause it supported and the funds it raised for disadvantaged children. Instead, it seemed likely that the focus would once again be on perceived flaws in a 7-year-old's behavior. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, the royal family said their goodbyes with characteristic grace. Alexander, despite his fatigue, managed to shake hands and thank guests for coming, his natural politeness earning warm smiles from everyone he encountered. Foreign Minister Elizabeth Nordberg pulled Princess Isabella aside as she prepared to leave. "Your Highness, I wanted to compliment you on Prince Alexander's behavior tonight. He was a credit to your family, polite, engaged, and genuinely interested in the cause. My own grandchildren could learn from his example." Isabella thanked her warmly, but the compliment was tinged with irony given what she suspected would be the next day's coverage. Positive assessments from actual attendees rarely received the same attention as manufactured controversies from the media. Back in his apartment, Thornfield was already writing follow-up articles based on the photographs Mitchell had sent throughout the evening. He had enough material for several stories, each designed to chip away at the royal family's public image by focusing on trivial imperfections in a child's behavior. "Royal Protocol Breached at Charity Gala" was the headline for his main story, which would focus on Alexander's spontaneous standing ovation as a violation of formal etiquette. Another piece, Questions Mount About Royal Parenting, would use the photographs of Alexander's tired moments to suggest inadequate preparation and supervision. At the palace, Alexander was finally released from his formal uniform and into comfortable pajamas. As his mother tucked him into bed, he reflected on the evening with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. "Mama, why do some people seem angry when they take my picture? They don't smile like the people who were actually talking to me tonight." Isabella chose her words carefully. "Some people have jobs that require them to take photographs, darling. They're not necessarily angry, they're just working. But remember, the people who matter most are the ones who take time to actually talk with you and get to know you." "Like Ambassador Vasquez and Dr. Chun?" "Exactly like them. Those are the conversations that matter, not the pictures." As Alexander drifted off to sleep, he had no way of knowing that hundreds of photographs from his evening were being analyzed, edited, and prepared for publication in ways that would present his innocent behavior as evidence of poor upbringing and disrespectful attitudes. In newsrooms across the country, editors were reviewing Thornfield's submitted articles and photographs, recognizing their potential to generate significant public interest. Royal stories always sold well, but stories that suggested problems within the royal family were particularly lucrative. The decision to run Thornfield's pieces was made not based on their accuracy or fairness, but on their potential to drive circulation and website traffic. In an increasingly competitive media landscape, sensationalism often trumped responsible journalism, especially when the targets were public figures considered fair game for criticism. Crown Prince Edmund and Princess Isabella sat in their private sitting room, reviewing the evening's events. Both were exhausted from hours of public interaction, but they were also pleased with how successfully the charity gala had achieved its goals.
"Alexander did wonderfully tonight," Isabella said, removing her jewelry. "He was polite, engaged, and genuinely moved by Emma's story.
I think tonight proved he's ready for more public appearances." Edmund agreed, but he couldn't shake Captain Morrison's warning about increasing online criticism. "I just hope the media coverage focuses on the charity's important work rather than looking for problems where none exist."
Neither parent could have anticipated how thoroughly their hopes would be disappointed.
By morning, their son's innocent behavior would be transformed into evidence of royal dysfunction, setting in motion a cascade of criticism that would fundamentally change how the public viewed their family.
The printing presses began running at midnight, carrying Thornfield's stories to newsstands across the kingdom. Social media algorithms, designed to promote engaging content regardless of its accuracy, began amplifying the most sensational interpretations of the evening's events.
Alexander slept peacefully in his room, surrounded by stuffed animals and children's books, completely unaware that his world was about to change dramatically. The morning would bring a level of scrutiny and criticism that no 7-year-old should ever have to face, transforming an evening of charitable success into the beginning of a very public ordeal. The morning sun had barely risen over Oldenburg Palace when Princess Isabella's private secretary, Margaret Whitmore, knocked urgently on the royal couple's bedroom door. It was 6:30 in the morning, far earlier than the scheduled briefings, and the urgency in Margaret's voice immediately put both parents on high alert. "Your Highnesses, I'm terribly sorry to wake you so early, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention," Margaret said through the door, her usually composed voice betraying obvious stress.
Crown Prince Edmund opened the door, already reaching for his dressing gown. "What's happened, Margaret?"
"Sir, this morning's newspapers are running extensive coverage of last night's charity gala, but the focus is entirely on Prince Alexander. The headlines are quite critical, and the palace communications team believes we need to address this immediately before it spreads further." Isabella joined them in the hallway, her maternal instincts immediately activated by the mention of her son.
"How critical are we talking about, Margaret?"
Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with having to deliver such news.
The Daily Herald's headline reads, "Royal Brat Disrupts Charity Gala." The Constitutional Review has questions mount about royal discipline.
There are 6 major newspapers running similar stories, and social media is already amplifying the coverage significantly.
The blood drained from Isabella's face.
She had expected some coverage, perhaps even mild criticism, but the systematic nature of the attack suggested something more organized than typical royal reporting.
Edmund's jaw tightened visibly.
"I want to see every article, every photograph, and every social media post.
Now."
They convened in Edmund's private office, where the communications team had already assembled copies of all major newspapers alongside printed screenshots of the most problematic social media posts. The sight that greeted them was worse than they had imagined. Marcus Thornfield's articles had been picked up and expanded by other publications, each adding their own inflammatory commentary. The photographs, expertly selected and captioned, painted a picture of a spoiled child disrupting a formal event through poor behavior and lack of discipline.
The image of Alexander standing during Emma's speech was captioned, "Royal Protocol Breached, Prince Alexander Stands Inappropriately During Formal Presentations."
The photograph of him asking for water was labeled "Disruptive Behavior, Young Prince Interrupts Proceedings with Demands." Even his tired leaning against his mother became undisciplined display, "Royal Child Shows Disrespect for Formal Setting." Director of Communications Sarah Phillips spread additional materials across the conference table with obvious distress.
"Your Highnesses, this is unlike anything we've seen before in terms of coordination and intensity.
These articles appear to have been planned in advance, with multiple outlets running similar pieces simultaneously."
"What do you mean by coordinated?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
The language used across different publications is remarkably similar, suggesting either shared source material or deliberate collaboration. More concerning is that several of the quoted palace sources are describing incidents that never occurred or making statements that contradict our actual protocols. Edmund studied the newspapers spread before him, his anger building with each fabricated quote and misleading caption. These aren't even real sources, are they? We have no record of any palace staff making these statements, and several of the described incidents simply didn't happen. This appears to be a coordinated character assassination targeting Prince Alexander specifically. The most disturbing aspect was how quickly the false narrative had taken hold online. Social media platforms were filled with memes mocking a 7-year-old boy, hashtags calling for royal reform, and increasingly personal attacks on Alexander's character and appearance. Isabella felt physically sick as she scrolled through the social media posts on Margaret's tablet. Comments ranged from "spoiled brat needs discipline" to typical royal entitlement starting young to much worse observations that she couldn't bear to read completely. "How many people have seen this?" she asked quietly. Phillips consulted her notes. The initial articles have been shared over 50,000 times across various platforms. The hashtags #royalbrat and #disciplinealexander are trending nationally. Conservative estimates suggest the story has reached over 2 million people in the first 6 hours. The scope of the attack was staggering. In the span of one night, their 7-year-old son had been transformed from a child attending a charity event into a national symbol of everything critics disliked about the monarchy. Edmund stood up abruptly, pacing behind his desk. "I want to know who organized this. This level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. Someone planned this attack specifically targeting my son." Captain Morrison, who had been quietly reviewing security implications, looked up from his notes. "Sir, we're already investigating possible connections between the various publications involved. However, our immediate concern should be Prince Alexander's safety and well-being." "What kind of safety concerns?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The online commentary is becoming increasingly hostile. While we haven't identified any specific threats yet, the level of personal animosity being directed at a 7-year-old is unprecedented. We should consider modifying his security protocols." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hartwell appearing in the doorway, her usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "Your Highnesses, Prince Alexander is awakened, asking about the increased security presence outside his room. Several photographers have gathered at the school gates, and there are more reporters at the palace entrance than I've ever seen." Isabella's heart sank. Alexander would have to be told something about why his normal routine was being disrupted, but explaining that the entire country was criticizing him based on fabricated stories seemed impossible. "How is he this morning?" Edmund asked. "Perfectly normal, sir. He's asking about feeding Duchess and whether he can play in the garden before breakfast. He has no idea that anything has changed." The innocence of his concerns, feeding his dog and playing outside, provided a stark contrast to the national controversy swirling around him. Here was a little boy worried about normal childhood activities while adults across the country debated his character and upbringing based on deliberately misleading information. Phillips cleared her throat diplomatically. "Your Highnesses, we need to make some immediate decisions about how to respond. Ignoring this might allow the false narrative to solidify, but responding could legitimize the attacks and draw more attention to them." Isabella turned to her husband. "What would happen if we issued a simple statement clarifying what actually occurred last night?" "That's one option," Phillips replied carefully. "However, dignifying false accusations with responses can sometimes backfire. It might suggest that the claims were serious enough to warrant official denial, which could encourage more aggressive coverage." Edmund studied the timeline Phillips had prepared showing how the story had spread. "Who benefits from this attack? Because someone clearly orchestrated this, and I want to know why my 7-year-old son was targeted." The political implications were becoming clearer as they analyzed the coverage. Several opposition political parties had been calling for reduced royal funding, and the portrayal of Alexander as spoiled and undisciplined served their arguments about wasteful royal spending. Margaret Whitmore consulted her notes. "Sir, there's something else.
We've received 12 interview requests this morning from major media outlets, all specifically asking to discuss Prince Alexander's behavioral issues and your parenting approach. The feeding frenzy was intensifying. What had begun as a single coordinated attack was now generating its own momentum, with media outlets competing to find new angles on the story. Isabella felt tears of frustration welling up. They're treating him like a political target instead of a child. How do we explain to a 7-year-old that people he's never met are saying terrible things about him based on lies? We don't, Edmund said firmly. We protect him from this as much as possible while we figure out how to stop it. But, even as he spoke, they all knew that completely shielding Alexander would be impossible. The story was too big, too widespread, and growing too quickly. Their son would inevitably encounter some version of the criticism, whether through overheard conversations, changed security procedures, or well-meaning friends trying to offer support. Phillips presented several response strategies, each with significant drawbacks. A defensive response might legitimize the attacks. An aggressive response could escalate the situation. Silence might be interpreted as admission of guilt. There's another factor to consider, Captain Morrison added. Prince Alexander's school has contacted us about the increased media presence at their gates. They're concerned about disruption to other students and the safety implications of having so many photographers focused on one 7-year-old child. The ripple effects were expanding beyond just the royal family. Alexander's classmates and their parents were now being drawn into the controversy, forced to navigate increased security and media attention simply because their children attended school with him. Isabella made a decision. I want to speak with Emma Kowalski and her family. Her speech last night was beautiful, and Alexander's response was genuine and appropriate. If they're willing, their perspective on what actually happened could provide important context. It was a reasonable suggestion, but Phillips looked uncomfortable. Your Highness, Emma's family has already been contacted by several media outlets asking for comment about Prince Alexander's behavior last night. They've declined all interviews so far, but the pressure is significant. The realization that a 12-year-old charity beneficiary was being dragged into attacks on a 7-year-old prince demonstrated how completely the situation had spiraled beyond any reasonable bounds. Edmund picked up one of the newspapers, staring at a photograph of his son that had been cropped and edited to make him appear more defiant than he actually had been. This isn't about Alexander's behavior or our parenting. This is about destroying faith in the monarchy by attacking our most vulnerable family member. The strategic nature of the attack was becoming undeniable. Rather than targeting Edmund's policies or Isabella's charitable work, critics had chosen to focus on a child who couldn't defend himself and whose normal childhood behavior could be easily misrepresented. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway again. Your Highnesses, Prince Alexander is asking why he can't go outside to play. He's seen the increased security and the cameras at the gates, and he's starting to ask questions. The moment they had been dreading was arriving. Their son's innocence about the situation was about to end, and they had no good way to explain why his life had suddenly changed overnight. Isabella stood up, steeling herself for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life as a mother. I'll talk to him. But first, I want every resource we have focused on identifying who organized this attack. Someone made a deliberate decision to target my child, and I want to know who and why. As she prepared to leave the office, Phillips handed her a final piece of information that made the situation even more complex. Your Highness, there's one more thing. The charity from last night has received several calls from donors threatening to withdraw their support unless the royal family addresses Prince Alexander's inappropriate behavior. The good work from last night is being overshadowed by this manufactured controversy. The attack wasn't just harming their family, it was undermining the charitable work they had spent years building. Children who desperately needed educational support might lose funding because their cause had become associated with fabricated royal drama. Isabella felt a surge of anger unlike anything she had experienced before. As a mother, she could accept criticism directed at herself or even her husband. But watching her innocent child become a target while simultaneously seeing vulnerable children lose charitable support pushed her beyond her usual diplomatic restraint. Find out who did this, she said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. And, when you do, make sure they understand that attacking children, any children, royal or otherwise, will not be tolerated.
The battle lines were being drawn for a confrontation that would test not only the royal family's resilience, but also the public's willingness to accept the targeting of children in political warfare. Princess Isabella found her son in his playroom, carefully arranging toy soldiers while Duchess lay contentedly beside him. The scene of innocent childhood normalcy stood in stark contrast to the chaos erupting throughout the kingdom about him. Alexander looked up with his characteristic bright smile when his mother entered, completely unaware that his world had changed overnight.
"Good morning, Mama. I was just setting up a battle between the good knights and the dragon."
"Duchess is the dragon, but she's a very friendly one," Alexander said, his 7-year-old imagination fully engaged in his game. Isabella sat down beside him on the carpet, her heart breaking as she watched him play. How could she explain to this innocent child that people across the country were saying horrible things about him based on complete lies? How could she tell him that his natural reactions at a charity event had been twisted into evidence of poor character? "Alexander, darling, I need to talk to you about something important," she began carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a diplomat but the love of a mother. Alexander's attention shifted to her completely, his toy soldiers momentarily forgotten. At 7, he was already developing an understanding that serious conversations with his parents usually meant changes to his routine or explanations about his royal responsibilities. "Did I do something wrong at the party last night?" he asked with surprising directness. "I tried to remember all my manners like you and Papa taught me." The question pierced Isabella's heart. Her son's first instinct was to assume he had failed somehow, which suggested he was already beginning to internalize the pressure of constant scrutiny. "No, sweetheart, you were perfect last night. You were polite, kind, and you showed real compassion when Emma told her story. Papa and I were very proud of you." Alexander's relief was visible, but his expression remained curious. "Then, why are there so many cameras outside? And why couldn't I go to the garden this morning?" Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that whatever she said next would mark the end of her son's complete innocence about his public position. Sometimes, when people take pictures at events like last night's dinner, they don't always tell the whole story about what happened. Some people have written things in newspapers that aren't quite accurate about the party. "What kind of things?" Alexander asked with the straightforward curiosity that only children possess. "They're suggesting that you weren't behaving properly, which isn't true. But, when newspapers print things like that, it makes other people interested in taking more pictures and asking more questions." Alexander considered this seriously, his young mind working to understand the adult complexities being thrust upon him. "So the cameras are there because people think I was naughty, even though I wasn't?" "Exactly. And, because some people believe what they read in newspapers without knowing the real story, we need to be extra careful for a little while until this settles down." It was a simplified explanation, but Isabella hoped it would help Alexander understand the increased security and changes to his routine without overwhelming him with the full scope of the attacks being directed at him. "Can I see what the newspapers said?" Alexander asked innocently. Isabella's stomach clenched. The last thing she wanted was for her 7-year-old to read descriptions of himself as a spoiled brat or royal embarrassment. But she also knew that trying to shield him completely might backfire if he eventually encountered the coverage elsewhere. The newspapers used some very unfair words, darling. Words that don't describe the wonderful boy you are. "That's why Papa and I don't want you to worry about what they wrote." Alexander seemed to accept this explanation, but his next question revealed how the situation was already affecting him. "Will I still be able to go to school? And will my friends still want to play with me?" The heartbreaking innocence of his concerns, school and friendships, reminded Isabella that underneath all the royal protocol and public scrutiny, Alexander was simply a little boy who wanted to learn and play with children his own age. Meanwhile, in the palace's communications office, the crisis management team was working frantically to understand the scope and coordination of the attack on Prince Alexander. Digital forensics expert Dr. Amanda Richardson had been called in to analyze the social media patterns surrounding the story's spread. "The amplification patterns are definitely artificial," Dr. Richardson explained to Director Phillips and Captain Morrison.
The story gained momentum too quickly and too uniformly to be purely organic. Someone used coordinated bot networks to ensure maximum visibility. Phillips studied the data with growing concern. So this wasn't just opportunistic journalism. Someone invested significant resources in ensuring this story would dominate the news cycle. Correct. The initial articles were pushed by at least 1,500 automated accounts within the first 2 hours. The hashtags trending against Prince Alexander were boosted by accounts with suspicious activity patterns. They only became active recently and exclusively post political content critical of the monarchy. Captain Morrison leaned over the technical readouts. Can we trace who's behind the bot networks? Dr. Richardson shook her head. These are sophisticated operations, probably run through multiple countries to avoid detection. However, the timing and coordination suggest domestic political motivation rather than foreign interference. The evidence was building that the attack on Alexander wasn't random media sensationalism, but a calculated political operation designed to undermine public support for the royal family by targeting their most vulnerable member. Back in Alexander's playroom, Isabella was trying to maintain as much normalcy as possible when Crown Prince Edmund joined them. His expression was carefully controlled, but Isabella could see the anger and frustration he was working to suppress. "How's our brave knight this morning?" Edmund asked, sitting down beside Alexander and picking up one of the toy soldiers. "Papa, Mama says the newspapers told lies about me, but that we don't need to worry about it," Alexander replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often display when dealing with adult problems they don't fully understand. Edmund exchanged a look with his wife over their son's head. They had agreed to present a united front of calm confidence, but the strain was evident in both their faces. "That's right, son. Sometimes people make mistakes or don't tell stories correctly. The important thing is that you know you behaved beautifully last night, and Mama and I are very proud of you." Alexander seemed satisfied with this explanation and returned to his toy soldiers, but his parents could see that he was processing the conversation. At 7, he was old enough to understand that something significant was happening, even if the full implications were beyond his comprehension. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Your Highnesses, I've received a call from Prince Alexander's school. They're requesting a meeting to discuss the current situation and its potential impact on the other students." The ripple effects were expanding exactly as they had feared. Alexander's presence at school was now creating complications for other families, forcing them to deal with increased security and media attention they never asked for. "What specific concerns do they have?" Edmund asked. The headmaster mentioned that several parents have called expressing worry about their children's safety with so many photographers at the school gates. There's also concern about the educational environment being disrupted. Isabella felt a new wave of guilt. Not only was their son being unfairly attacked, but his situation was now affecting innocent classmates and their families. "Schedule the meeting for this afternoon," Edmund decided. "We need to address their concerns directly." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Alexander looked up from his toys. "Are my friends at school worried about me because of the newspaper lies?" The perceptiveness of the question surprised both parents. Alexander was clearly understanding more about the situation than they had given him credit for. "Some people might be confused about what really happened last night," Isabella explained carefully. "But your real friends know what kind of person you are, and that's what matters most." "Like Tommy and Sarah and Ben?" "Exactly like them. They know you're kind and fun and a good friend. That's much more important than what newspapers write." Alexander seemed reassured by this, but Edmund could see his son's innocence being chipped away in real time. The boy was being forced to develop coping mechanisms for adult criticism that no 7-year-old should need. The conversation was interrupted by Phillips arriving with urgent updates. She waited until Alexander was engrossed in his toys before speaking quietly to his parents. "Your Highnesses, we've had 3 international news organizations request statements about the royal discipline crisis. This story is going global." Edmund felt his blood pressure rising. A 7-year-old standing to applaud an inspiring speech is now an international incident? The narrative has shifted beyond the original event,
Phillips explained. Foreign media are now analyzing Prince Alexander's behavior at previous public appearances, looking for patterns of problematic conduct. Isabella closed her eyes in frustration. They're retroactively examining everything he's ever done in public through this distorted lens.
Unfortunately, yes.
We have requests for comment on his behavior at last Christmas's tree lighting, the spring flower show, and even his first public appearance as a toddler. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clearer. Critics weren't just responding to one event, they were constructing an entirely fictional narrative about Alexander's character by reinterpreting years of normal childhood behavior as evidence of poor upbringing. Alexander, oblivious to the adult conversation happening around him, had moved on to playing with Duchess. The sight of him laughing as the golden retriever gently took a toy from his hand provided a moment of pure innocence in the midst of the manufactured crisis.
"Mama, can Duchess come with me to school today?" Alexander asked suddenly.
She might help the other children feel better about the cameras. The suggestion was so purely 7-year-old in its logic that a friendly dog could solve complex adult problems that Isabella almost started crying. Her son was already trying to take responsibility for making others feel better about a situation he had no role in creating.
"That's a very thoughtful idea, sweetheart," she managed to say. "But schools have rules about animals, remember?"
Alexander accepted this with typical childhood resilience and returned to his game, but the moment had revealed how deeply he was already thinking about the impact of his situation on others.
Phillips consulted her notes. "Your Highnesses, there's one more development.
Marcus Thornfield, the journalist who wrote the original articles, has been contacted by a major television network.
They want to interview him about his investigation into royal family dynamics." Edmund stood up abruptly. "Investigation?"
He fabricated quotes and misrepresented photographs of a child.
"That's not journalism, it's character assassination. The network is presenting it as an exposé of royal privilege and accountability. They're framing Thornfield as a crusading journalist uncovering uncomfortable truths about royal parenting."
The transformation of Thornfield from fabricator to hero in the media narrative demonstrated how completely the story had been distorted.
The man who had deliberately lied about a 7-year-old's behavior was now being celebrated as an advocate for royal accountability.
Isabella watched her son playing peacefully, completely absorbed in his innocent game while adults across multiple continents debated his character based on deliberately misleading information. The contrast between his reality and his public perception had become so extreme that it seemed almost surreal. "What happens next?" she asked Phillips quietly. "That depends on how far this story spreads and whether other media outlets continue amplifying it. If the international coverage grows, it could become a defining narrative about Prince Alexander that follows him for years." The long-term implications were staggering. Their 7-year-old son was at risk of being permanently labeled as problematic based on a coordinated attack using fabricated evidence. The damage to his reputation could affect his entire future role in the royal family and his relationship with the public he would someday serve.
Edmund looked at his son, who was now teaching Duchess to march like the toy soldiers.
The sight of innocent childhood play occurring alongside an international crisis about that same child's character seemed to encapsulate the madness of their situation. "Then, we stop it," he said quietly but with unmistakable determination. "Whatever it takes, we stop this before it permanently damages our son."
The battle for Alexander's reputation and future was about to intensify dramatically.
3 weeks after the charity gala that had transformed their lives, the royal family sat together in their private dining room for what had become their daily strategy meeting. Crown Prince Edmund had dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights spent coordinating their response to the ongoing attacks on his 7-year-old son. Princess Isabella's usual serene composure had been replaced by a steely determination that surprised even those who knew her best.
Prince Alexander, however, had shown remarkable resilience that both impressed and broke his parents' hearts. He had adapted to the increased security, the changed routines, and the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms with a maturity that no child should need to develop. "The forensic analysis is complete," Director Phillips announced, spreading documents across the polished table. "Dr. Richardson's team has traced the coordinated attack back to its source." "You're not going to like what we found." Edmund leaned forward, his jaw already tightening in anticipation. Tell me everything.
The operation was funded and coordinated by the Alliance for Democratic Reform, the political organization led by Marcus Brennan. They paid Marcus Thornfield €50,000 to write the initial articles and hired a professional social media manipulation company to amplify the story. Isabella felt her blood run cold. Brennan was a prominent opposition politician who had been calling for the abolition of the monarchy for years, but targeting a 7-year-old child represented a new low even for him. They have documented communications discussing the need to humanize their critique of royal privilege by focusing on the younger generation, Phillips continued, reading from printed emails. One message specifically states that the child's natural behavior can be reframed to demonstrate the systemic problems with hereditary privilege. The calculating nature of the attack was breathtaking. Adult politicians had deliberately targeted a child's innocent behavior as a weapon in their ideological campaign against the institution of monarchy. Alexander entered the dining room at that moment, having finished his morning lessons with his tutor. His presence immediately shifted the tone of the conversation, as it had for the past 3 weeks. Every adult discussion now had to be carefully calibrated to avoid exposing him to details that would be inappropriate for a 7-year-old to process. Good morning, everyone, Alexander said politely, taking his seat between his parents. Mrs. Patterson says I'm getting much better at French pronunciation. Would you like to hear me count to 20? The normalcy of his request, a child proud of his academic progress, provided a stark contrast to the adult machinations being discussed around him. Here was the real Alexander, intelligent, eager to learn, and innocent of any wrongdoing, while powerful adults continued to debate his character based on fabricated narratives. We would love to hear it, darling, Isabella said, grateful for the momentary return to normal family interaction. Alexander proudly counted in French, his pronunciation carefully enunciated as Mrs. Patterson had taught him. His parents applauded warmly, and, for a brief moment, they were simply a family celebrating a child's educational achievement. That was excellent, Edmund praised genuinely. You're working very hard with your studies. Mrs. Patterson says that learning languages will help me understand different people when I'm older, Alexander replied seriously. She says that good princes need to know how to talk with everyone. The innocence of his ambition, wanting to be a good prince who could connect with all people, made the attacks against him even more grotesque. Critics were vilifying a child whose greatest concern was learning to serve others effectively. After Alexander returned to his lessons, the adults resumed their serious discussion. Phillips had more disturbing information to share. The Alliance for Democratic Reform has announced they're planning a royal accountability rally for next week. Their promotional materials specifically mention addressing the failure of royal parenting and feature photographs of Prince Alexander from the charity gala. Edmund stood up sharply, his diplomatic restraint finally breaking. They're using my son's image to promote a political rally? A 7-year-old child is being turned into a campaign poster for their cause? Unfortunately, yes. They're arguing that since Prince Alexander is a public figure who will someday hold official positions, his behavior is a legitimate subject for political discourse. Isabella felt a rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. He's 7 years old. He doesn't hold any positions. He's a child who attended a charity event and clapped for an inspiring speech. The legal implications were complex. As members of the royal family, they had limited recourse against political criticism, even when it targeted their children. The Alliance for Democratic Reform was carefully staying within the bounds of legal political expression while morally crossing every line of decency. Captain Morrison entered with additional security briefings. Your Highnesses, we've had to increase Prince Alexander's protection detail again. The online threats haven't reached credible levels, but the volume of negative attention directed at him continues to grow. What kind of attention? Edmund asked, though he dreaded the answer. Social media accounts dedicated to mocking him, websites analyzing his every public appearance for signs of problematic behavior, and discussion forums where people debate his personality and upbringing. It's unprecedented for a child his age. The digital persecution was relentless. Alexander couldn't appear in public without generating hundreds of comments analyzing his facial expressions, body language, and behavior. Every smile was interpreted as smugness, every moment of tiredness as disrespect, every natural childhood reaction as evidence of poor discipline. Isabella made a decision that had been building for weeks. I want to speak publicly about this. Not through official statements or press releases, but directly to the people. They need to understand what's being done to our child. Phillips looked concerned. Your Highness, engaging directly could escalate the situation. It might draw more attention to the attacks rather than defusing them. The attacks are already at maximum intensity, Isabella replied firmly. My son is being used as a political weapon by adults who should know better. If I don't speak up for him, who will? Edmund studied his wife's determined expression. What do you have in mind? A television interview. Not formal or scripted, but honest. Let people see the real mother talking about the real child, rather than the political caricature they've created. It was a risky strategy. Royal family members rarely gave personal interviews, and discussing attacks on their children could be seen as either humanizing or undignified, depending on public reception. Mrs. Hartwell appeared with Alexander's afternoon schedule. Your Highnesses, Prince Alexander has asked if he can invite his friend Tommy for a playdate this weekend. Should I coordinate with Tommy's parents about the security arrangements? The simple request highlighted how their son's childhood had been complicated by circumstances beyond his control. Even having a friend over now required security protocols and careful coordination. Of course he can have his friend over, Isabella said immediately. Whatever arrangements are necessary, we'll make them work. After Mrs. Hartwell left, Phillips presented the family's limited options. We can continue with our current strategy of minimal response and hope the story loses momentum naturally. We can escalate with stronger legal action against the most egregious false statements. Or we can go public with a more aggressive defense. What would aggressive defense look like? Edmund asked. We could release the security footage from the charity gala showing Prince Alexander's actual behavior throughout the evening. We could arrange for guests from that night to speak publicly about their interactions with him. We could provide detailed rebuttals to every false claim that's been made. Isabella considered the options carefully. And the downside of aggressive defense? It could be seen as the royal family using their resources to silence legitimate criticism. It might generate more coverage rather than less. And it definitely means Prince Alexander will be even more central to the public conversation. The impossible choice facing them was whether to let false narratives stand unchallenged or to fight back in ways that would subject their son to even more scrutiny. Alexander returned from his lessons carrying a drawing he had made during art time. The picture showed the royal family standing together outside the palace, with Duchess prominently featured and a rainbow overhead. I drew this for the family room, he announced proudly. Mrs. Patterson says it shows familial solidarity, which means we stick together. Isabella examined the drawing with tears in her eyes. In his innocent artwork, Alexander had captured something the adult critics had missed entirely, that he was part of a loving family that supported each other through difficulties. It's beautiful, sweetheart. What gave you the idea for the rainbow? Mrs. Patterson read us a story about how rainbows come after storms. I thought our family could use a rainbow since everyone seems so worried lately. The metaphor was perfectly chosen by a child who understood, at some level, that his family was weathering a storm while hoping for better days ahead. That afternoon, Isabella made her decision. She scheduled a television interview with veteran journalist Caroline Meadows, known for her respectful but thorough approach to difficult subjects. I won't let political opportunists destroy my child's reputation for their own gain, she told Edmund. Alexander deserves to have his mother fight for him. The interview would be risky, but the alternative, allowing the false narratives to define their son permanently, was unacceptable. 3 days later, Princess Isabella sat across from Caroline Meadows in the palace's blue drawing room, the same room where the family had taken photographs before the charity gala that started this crisis. Your Highness, thank you for agreeing to speak with us during what must be an incredibly difficult time for your family, Meadows began. Isabella looked directly into the camera, her mother's love and determination evident in every word. Caroline, I'm speaking today not as a princess, but as a mother whose 7-year-old son has been subjected to a coordinated campaign of lies and character assassination. These are strong accusations.
Can you elaborate?
We have documented evidence that the attacks on Alexander were planned and funded by political organizations seeking to undermine the monarchy. They deliberately took innocent moments from a child attending a charity event and twisted them into false narratives about his character and our parenting. Isabella's voice remained calm but carried unmistakable conviction. My son stood up and applauded when a 12-year-old girl courageously shared her story of overcoming poverty.
That natural, compassionate reaction has been portrayed as disruptive behavior.
He asked for a sip of water during a long formal dinner, which any child might need, and this was characterized as making demands.
Meadows leaned forward. How has this affected Prince Alexander personally? He's 7 years old, Caroline.
He should be worried about homework and playing with his friends, not about whether strangers think he's well behaved. We've had to increase his security because of the level of negative attention. His school has been disrupted. His friends' families have been affected.
Isabella's composure finally showed a crack.
But what breaks my heart most is that he's already trying to take responsibility for making other people comfortable with this situation. He asked if his dog could come to school to help other children feel better about all the cameras. That's the kind of child he really is, someone who worries about helping others even when he's the one being attacked. The interview continued for 30 minutes, with Isabella methodically dismantling each false claim while sharing specific examples of Alexander's genuine character and behavior. She spoke about his kindness to staff, his enthusiasm for learning, his concern for the children helped by their charitable work.
Your Highness, what do you want people to understand about this situation?
Isabella looked directly into the camera again, speaking to every parent who might be watching. I want people to understand that when we allow children to be used as political weapons, we damage something fundamental about our society.
Alexander didn't choose to be born into a royal family. He didn't choose to be in the public eye.
But he's being held responsible for political opinions about an institution he's too young to even fully understand. My son is a good child who deserves the same protection from adult political manipulation that every child deserves. And I will fight for that protection with everything I have. The interview aired that evening, reaching over 4 million viewers across the kingdom and millions more internationally through social media sharing.
The public response was swift and decisive. Within hours, hashtags supporting Alexander and criticizing the attacks on him began trending.
Parents across the country shared stories about their own 7-year-old's behavior at formal events, highlighting how normal and innocent Alexander's actions had been. Marcus Brennan and the Alliance for Democratic Reform found themselves facing intense criticism for their tactics. Several of their own supporters publicly distanced themselves from the attacks on a child, describing them as indefensible regardless of political differences with the monarchy. The charity that had benefited from the original gala experienced a surge in donations as people sought to support the cause Alexander had inadvertently promoted through his genuine emotional response to Emma's speech. Most importantly, the false narratives about Alexander's character began to crumble as the truth became more widely understood.
2 weeks after Isabella's interview, the royal family attended a small ceremony honoring young environmental activists.
Alexander participated with obvious comfort and natural grace, interacting warmly with the other children and listening attentively to their presentations.
The media coverage was dramatically different this time.
Instead of looking for problems, journalists noted his genuine interest in the young activist's work and his age-appropriate behavior throughout the event. After the ceremony, as the family walked back to their car, Alexander tugged on his mother's hand. "Mama, there are fewer angry cameras today," he observed with 7-year-old directness. Isabella smiled down at her son, realizing that he had been more aware of the hostile attention than they had given him credit for.
"Yes, darling. I think people are remembering that you're a good boy who deserves to be treated kindly." "Like the rainbow after the storm?"
"Exactly like the rainbow after the storm." As they drove back to the palace, Alexander chatted excitedly about the young environmentalists he had met, already planning ways he might help support their work when he was older. The innocence and genuine concern for others that had been distorted into evidence of poor character was reasserting itself naturally. The crisis had revealed important truths about both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of royal family life in the modern era. Alexander had survived his first major public controversy with his character intact and his spirit unbroken, though the experience had undoubtedly changed him in ways that would only become apparent as he grew older. Crown Prince Edmund watched his son through the car window as they approached the palace gates. The boy who had been systematically attacked by adult political operatives was pointing out interesting architecture to his mother, his natural curiosity and enthusiasm completely restored. "He's stronger than we thought," Edmund said quietly to Isabella. "He shouldn't have had to be," she replied, though her voice carried pride along with the lingering anger about what their son had endured. "No, he shouldn't have. But he survived it, and maybe that strength will serve him well in the future." As they arrived at the palace, Alexander was already planning his afternoon activities, the political storm that had consumed the adult world for weeks now just another experience in his young life. His resilience and essential goodness had proven stronger than the manufactured controversies designed to destroy them. The rainbow after the storm was finally beginning to appear.